Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look once again at the Freestyle Chess GOAT Challenge being held in Wiesenhaus, Germany. Now the first 2 days feature the qualification process. Players played rapid games trying to determine their seedings, and today the players start playing for the first time ever classical Fischer random chess. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. The game of the day that we're going to be taking a look at is between Alireza with the white pieces and Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. So as you can see from the clock, both players starting off this game with an hour and a half on the clock. This is the first time that we've ever seen classical Fischer random chess. Normally games are played with a rapid time control at maybe 15 minutes, 25 minutes, etc. But this is the first time we see it, so it's definitely something new, and we'll see whether players will be able to come with the absolute best moves since they now have more time to think. So Alireza with the white pieces decides to open with e4 here against Magnus. Now, one thing that's very important to note about this, and I guess I should actually change the name so you get the pictures while we're at it, rather than just these grayed out images. I realized I did not do that ahead of time. 1 second. Is that in this in the opening when you're playing Fischer random chess, generally what you're trying to do is you're trying to look at possibilities here of how to either open up the center of the board or open up diagonals for the bishop. Now yesterday and the day before, I mentioned a couple of times that generally if you try to push a pawn, specifically the D or the E pawn, you want to have either a queen or the rook behind the pawn. So e4 is played here by Alireza, and I think the reason is pretty straightforward. First of all, you have the queen behind the pawn, but additionally you can always push this B pawn to open up the scope. Just like, for example, say you were to get a6, you can always just move your C pawn to open up the other scopes as well. So for Alireza, I think e4 makes a lot of sense here. Queen behind the pawn, you can open up both of the diagonals for the B's a little bit later on, and Magnus decides to play this move e5 here. After e5, we now get the move b4 from Alireza, trying to open up the diagonal for the bishop, and Magnus plays b5 with the classic mirror mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. So we have the mirror mirror, both sides having pushed the e and the b pawn same position, but now Alireza plays this move knight h3. Now knight h3 is a move that I really like, and what we're getting back to are some of the basic fundamental concepts from the game of chess. Now I can't really set it up easily on this board since it's with a random setup for move number 1, but in one of the openings, very specifically the Spanish and the Italian openings, a lot of the opening after e4 e5 hinges upon whether white can play d4 f4 or whether black can play d5 or f5. Whoever can generally attack the center quicker is usually better, and with knight h3 being played here by Alireza, it's pretty clear that his push with f4 here to attack the black center is going to be quicker, and I think that white has a little bit of an advantage. It's nothing to write home about, of course, but nonetheless, in a game where players don't have set preparation, you feel like fundamentally it should be easier to play. So after knight to h3, Magnus plays this wild move knight c to e7. Now this move is very surprising for a couple of reasons. First of all, it hangs the pawn on e5. Secondly, it doesn't follow up with the mirror with either knight to h6 or a move like knight f6 trying to pressure the pawn on e4. Now probably the reason Magnus did not play knight f6, he was worried that after d3 castles, for example, white gets f4 here, probably to play something like d6, and after castles, let's just say knight b6 and knight b3, white has this great long diagonal for the dark square bishop. Queen can go to g3, bishop can always go to h5, and it just feels like with the central pawn structure here, white having these pawns in e4 and f4 versus d6 and e5, white should be better. Now the funny thing, of course, is that the computer thinks it's only a small advantage, nothing super crazy, but from a human perspective, when you're thinking about basic logic of how you play the Italians, how you play Spanishes, the pawn structures that you get out of e4 e5, you just feel like this is better for white. So Magnus goes knight c to e7 here, which temporarily could hang the pawn, but he also has the idea, let's say white were to castle here, for example, of going knight to c6 here, trying to play this like a classic Spanish or Italian with a knight on c6, stopping the pawn, push to d4, and pressuring the pawn on b4, or going knight to g6 to try and counteract this f4 pawn push. Additionally, if white were to take right here, after knight to g6, white is to move the bishop, and after queen takes e4, threatening to win the pawn on g2, white most likely is to trade the queens, something like castles, castles, and knight to f6 here. Let's just say white goes knight b3 and castles, and now black is completely fine. So after knight to e7, Alireza decides to try and strike right away with this pawn push f4 here, trying to undermine black's center. Magnus takes, and now we get this move castles. Nice move from Alireza because black cannot guard this pawn at f4. If you go g5, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o, there goes the rook in the corner pocket, and you lose the game. So Magnus plays knight to g6 here, trying to pressure the pawn on e4, all the while trying to temporarily guard the pawn on f4. Alireza plays d3 here, building this nice connect 4 as well as a chain of 3 pawns, and now we get the move bishop to f6. Now bishop f6, another very nice move from Magnus here, because when you look at the position, white has this great long diagonal for this dark square bishop. Black is struggling, but when Magnus goes to f6, he gets rid of one of white's active bishops here, and it more or less means that it shouldn't be that dangerous. So we get the trade. Knight takes f4 played by Alireza. We get queen to e5, and now Alireza plays queen g3. Here Magnus plays the move rook e8. Now Magnus could have castled the king here. Probably he was worried that after knight takes knight, if he were to take the queen, there's knight e7 checking the king, and now white has an extra horse on the board. But after knight takes knight, black could play queen d4, because if white goes king h1 and you get f takes g6, suddenly the f file is opening up for the black rook here. White has 3 pieces which are underdeveloped at the moment, and black should be completely fine. So instead we get this move rook to e8 being played here by Magnus, and now Alireza trades on g6. Magnus here of course captures with the h pawn, because now if he were to take with f pawn after takes and bishop f3, white intends to go d4 and e5, kick the rook, kick the knight, and with this nice white center incoming and black's bad pawn structure, white should have a serious advantage. So after knight takes knight, we get h takes g6, capturing towards the center. We get the queen trade, and now Alireza goes rook b3. Now what you'll probably notice here is it's like, well, it's an endgame. Magnus Carlsen, greatest endgame player of all time. This cannot be dangerous for him. However, there are some serious issues, which is white can play either rook c3 or rook to a3 to pressure the pawns on c7 and a7, and this bishop on 8 is staring at a pawn chain, so it's not super active. So here Magnus plays this move a6, which is a big surprise to me, because Magnus is a player who's great at endgames, very good fundamental understanding of what pieces are good and bad in a given position, and he does not play this move d5, which would have made a lot of sense, trying to rip open the diagonal for the bishop. Let's say white were to take here. After knight takes d5, there's this knight e3 idea. Even bishop takes d5 maybe is okay as well, but after knight takes d5, let's say white goes bishop f3, so you can't move the knight. Black can simply castle the king, followed by knight to e3 here, and with control over this open e file and a nice wooden shield upcoming in a couple of moves, black has 0 issues, and honestly I want to say that I think Magnus might even win this position. So it's a big surprise here when Magnus decides to play the move a6, because after rook to a3, pressuring the pawn, we have bishop b7, rook to c3. Now Magnus has to go passive with knight to e8, guarding pawn on c7, and after knight to b3 here, it's evidently clear that Magnus will be unable to push this pawn to d5 here in the center, and without being able to push d5, it means this pawn chain restricts this light square bishop, and if anybody has an advantage here, it's going to be Alireza with the white pieces. So Magnus decides to castle. Now we get to move knight to c5 with the classic bastion here, temporarily kicking the bishop away from b7. We get bishop c8, bishop guards both pawns here, and now we have the move rook to a3 being played. Now it's getting very, very dire for Magnus very, very quickly, because his a6 pawn can no longer be defended. White is pressing it with both the knight and the rook, and there's no way of guarding it with another piece. You can only guard it with the bishop here, so Magnus is definitely in trouble. So Magnus plays knight to f6. Now we get knight takes pawn, bishop takes knight, rook takes, and finally Magnus gets d5 here in the center, breaking up this white pawn chain and trying to activate the towers on the open e file. Here Alireza trades the pawns, and now he goes a3, making sure black can't eat the juicer on b4, and now we get knight to e3. Alireza goes rook to e1, we get rook to e8, rook to c6, and now Magnus trades a knight for the bishop on d1. After takes, and rook e7, it feels like even though Magnus is in trouble here because he's down a pawn, with the open file on the e file here and these 2 towers stacked nicely with the double stack, it feels like black should have pretty good drawing chances. However, one issue in this tournament is Magnus Carlsen has been somewhat shaky in his rook and pawn endgames. He lost in a rook and pawn endgame against Nodirbek Abdusattorov yesterday, I believe it was, where it was a complete draw. He was down upon that endgame too. So would history repeat itself for a second day in a row? So after rook to e7, we get rook to d2 being played by Alireza, trying to stop Magnus from putting a rook on the second rank. Rook stops everything here. If black were to play rook e2, trying to get the rook in any way, after swap and rook takes c7, white is simply up 2 pawns here on the queen side and will win the game in short order. So after rook to d2, Magnus decides to go g5 here, trying to take some more space on the king side, start pushing these pawns and restrict white's activity. Alireza here goes h3, and now we get rook to f5. Magnus intending to potentially double stack his rooks on the back rank and try to checkmate the white king on h2. So Alireza plays d4, and this is a move that I really like here, because Alireza basically understands that Magnus's ideas of going all in trying to checkmate the king are a little bit slow here, and if black doesn't do something immediately, say black plays g6 for example, now white can play something like d5, and let's just say rook e5, rook c5, and suddenly white is going to be winning a second pawn here. I guess actually after rook d5, white could just go c4, takes, and after rook c4, white has two connected pass pawns, which he pushes up the board and will win the game in short order. So after d4, there's rook c5, there's d5, there's c4, and because of the 4-on-2 here on the queen side, and black having these double pawns on the g file, essentially counting as one less pawn in this endgame, it's very, very dire for Magnus. So after d4, we get rook to e1 from Magnus, and now Alireza goes king h2, and we get the move rook ff1. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what Magnus would love to do is get a position like this, for example, where he can go f4, and if white were to move the rook, there's rook to h1, which would be checkmate. King has no escape square, and if white plays a move like g3, for example, you can simply go f3 here, threatening mate on h1 again. White has to go g4 to create the square for the king, and now after rook to e2 check, takes, black will queen the pawn. If you go rook e6, queen takes, black has an extra rook. If you don't play rook e6, black gets the queen and wins the game anyway. So this is what Magnus is hoping for when he stacks the rooks on e1 and f1. Alireza here decides to play the move rook to c3, and now Magnus goes f5 with the aforementioned idea of f4. But here, king g3 is now playable, and the reason rook c3 made so much sense is that if we go back to say this position, say white were to take, after f5 here, if white plays king g3, black can check the king back and then go rook e1 again, and you probably have nothing better than to repeat with king g3, because again, if you play d5 and f4, you're going to get mated or lose a lot of material. So when Alireza plays rook c3, f5, king g3, now the rook stops black from playing the rook e3 check as the rook covers the square, and Magnus plays king h7. After king to h7, Alireza plays the move rook to f2, a very nice move, trying to force off one of the rooks here, because Alireza understands that in the endgame, with the 4-on-2 on the queen side, and the fact that you can always probably create two connected pass pawns, if you can get even one rook off the board, it almost ensures a guaranteed victory. So after rook to f2, Magnus plays the move f4, we get king to f3, and now we have this move rook to g1. Now the computer absolutely hates this move. In fact, the computer wants black to play this move king to h6. I personally would probably play king g6, and maybe it's the same thing or not. Maybe it's not. Oh, actually, maybe it's not, because after takes, king g4, if black plays rook f2, you have rook to c6, checking the king away, and then you can take the pawns, whereas when black goes king to h6 here, in this position after takes rook f2, if you go check, now black can block with the pawn and win the pawn on g2. So I probably would be considering king g6 here personally. King h6 is a computer move, and after king to h6, computer says white is better, but it's still not completely gone. But after Magnus plays rook to g1 here, we now get this move king to g4, and this, by the way, would not have been possible if Magnus had left a rook on f1, because then you would hang this rook on f2. So it's very important that once Magnus goes rook g1 here, Alireza plays king g4, because the rook is no longer under attack on f2, and now white has this active king pressuring both the pawns on g5 and f4. Rook on f2 guards g2, and at this point it's very, very close to loss. So Magnus goes king to h6 here, we get rook takes c7, and now the blunder with rook to e3. Now here the computer, I think, wanted g6 initially here to play for rook for another checkmate with rook to e3 and rook g3 here, but this is not what Magnus does. Instead, he goes rook to e3, we get king to f5, and now we have this move rook to e1, which does actually just lose the game outright. Computer still thinks that Magnus has decent chances to draw the game here if he were to play g6, because after g6, white cannot go back to g4. There's rook to g3, which would be checkmate, and after king to f6 here, now black goes rook g to e1, similar to the game. But after rook to e1 here, if white were to play, say, a move like d5, which looks like the logical move, now black has rook to e5, threatening to win the pawn, and if white pushes it forward, there's rook to f5, creating a very, very unusual ladder checkmate of the white king, as it cannot move to the e file. So white can't go d5, and let's say white were to play a move like king to f7, which is probably the best move. Now after rook to e4, again, if you go d5, there's the same trick with rook to f5 and rook to e8. And if you play c3 here, which is the best move, now black can play rook to e8 with the idea of rook to h8 and rook to h7 potentially. And weirdly enough, the computer does not think it's game over. But for a mere human like Magnus, or frankly any of us, I don't think it's realistic to expect this to happen, because it requires really deep understanding and the fact that not really being afraid of the reality that here you are missing some pawns in the center of the board. So instead, Magnus goes rook g to e1, and now Alireza plays rook to c6, and now everything is gone. And the reason it's gone is that if black goes king to h7 here, now white takes the pawn on g5, the f4 pawn will fall, and when we do the material count here in this position, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. So we have 5 versus 2. So white has 3 extra pawns here in this position in a rook and pawn endgame. No way that Magnus can save this. And after king to h5 is played, now Alireza plays this move, rook to g6 here, and Magnus Carlsen resigns the game on the spot because the only way to guard this pawn would be rook to g3 so that white can't take. But now after rook takes g7, white's threatening checkmate on h7 here. You have to go back, and after rook g6, king to h5, for example, rook g8, king to h6. Many ways for white to win here. Probably the simplest one is to go king to f6, threatening mate with rook to h8. And now if black goes king h5, rook h8 is mate, and after king to h7, white takes this pawn on g5, and again, white has way too many pawns here in this rook and pawn endgame, and it's all but hopeless. So after we get this move rook to g6 being played here, Magnus Carlsen resigns the game, and he goes down 1-0 to Alireza in their 2-game match of Fischer Random Classical Chess. A huge victory for Alireza. Honestly, a game where it seemed like he was in control from start to finish with very little drama. And it just goes to show that even though Magnus Carlsen is the best player in the world at classical chess and has the best understanding of a lot of the themes and pawn structures, they don't completely apply in the same way it feels like in Fischer Random. And Magnus has struggled both in the rapid portion and now today against Alireza. So it'll be very exciting to see if in the second game tomorrow, if Magnus is able to strike back. Now, one thing I'm not sure about with this tournament is it is a match format, but I don't know if the players will play the same position they played today with colors reversed, or if they'll just basically draw a new position with random assortment on the back rank. It's a big question mark. I don't know the answer to that, so we'll have to wait and see on it. Probably if they play the same position, that would be advantage Alireza, because now he can go back home or go back to his room and study the starting position and try to come up with the best defense with the black pieces. So it might be advantage him if they play a fresh new position. Essentially everybody's on the same footing. But we will have to wait and see. At any rate, Alireza Firouzja wins his first game of the 2-game match against Magnus Carlsen in the first classical Fischer Random event that we've ever seen. So Alireza off to a hot start. Magnus has to strike back tomorrow. I believe that if Magnus Carlsen does not win tomorrow with the white piece against Ali Firouzja in the second game of their match, he will be outright eliminated, and that will be the end of Magnus in this Fischer Random tournament. So it's going to be a very hype, very exciting day tomorrow, as we'll see if Magnus can clutch it up like he seems to do more often than not, even when he's not on his best form. So it'll be really exciting. So on that note, I hope you guys enjoyed this recap from the first day of the classical portion, or the classical knockout portion of the Fischer Random Freestyle GOAT Chess Challenge in Wiesenhaus, Germany. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back tomorrow with another recap when we find out if Magnus Carlsen has forced tiebreakers in this Fischer Random match, or if Alireza Firouzja, the rising junior player originally from Iran representing France, can dethrone the former world chess champion in 960. But it's going to be very exciting, and I hope you guys take a look at the video tomorrow. But on that note, I'll see you guys soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.